Stop.
Once people start getting bumped, like we haven't succeeded in knocking anybody out of power yet. People say, oh, Cuomo. No. We haven't succeeded in knocking anybody properly out of power yet. That was a palace coup. That was an inside job.
Mm-hmm.
We take over one of these prominent school boards, Loudoun County or whatever, the one in San Francisco or whatever. You start knocking a couple of these weird DAs that aren't doing their jobs out. You recall Gavin Newsom. All of a sudden, their calculus changes completely because they've been able to act almost fully unaccountably. You break the will that supports the teachers unions, something like this. These kinds of actions will have repercussions throughout their movement, and it's not going to be as pretty for them as they might hope. Their whole thing depends on being able to work unaccountably until the moment they have to pull out the rifles. And this is a different kind of country, and I don't know how they're going to be able to pull that kind of thing off here.
So I might want to give you a little bit of pushback on one of those answers, but I'll get there here in a minute. Yes, it's so funny. So I mentioned in Tampa to you, I'd asked you if you'd read Hayek's The Road to Serfdom. And one thing you said there is actually almost a direct quote from him about the nature of socialism. So the guy who I'm doing a Road to Serfdom book, you met him, my buddy Kevin, Engineering Politics Podcast. You met him in Minnesota the other night. I think Wisconsin, not Minnesota. Sorry, Kevin.
Wisconsin. He mentioned you actually.
Yeah, no, he's a great guy. And actually, I have a question from him that I want to ask you later. But Hayek makes that point about socialism that once they realize they're not going to get consensus on their policies, they have to use coercion, and they use all these different tactics of coercion.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them are force. Some of them are not recognized as force. There's a whole chapter called Why the Worst Get on Top. And it's about how once they build up this system of planning, and then there are people, like one of his main thesis is most socialists, like once they realize, or socialism can only be achieved by means that most socialists would find completely unpalatable once they realize like what they have to do. And whenever they create that vacuum, then the worst get on top after they've already, forged the ring, so to speak.
Right. Yeah, I've made that argument as well, separately, like the power vacuum, and that it fills in with psychopaths, basically.
Yep. And so there's that. But my question kind of flows, so I'm following the lines of what you said. One is that coercion, I think, in order for people to say no and reject it, has to be recognized as force. And it feels like they are conditioning a lot of people through those gatekeeping mechanisms, what Eric Weinstein calls the GIN, the gated institutional narrative.
Yeah.
And they are conditioning a lot of people that don't recognize as force the force. And so I think we have to at least try to localize or compartmentalize in some ways the way that we think about it, in terms of like people who will recognize it as force and people that won't. And it seems like Eric Hoffer has this whole quote in The True Believer about how, this was also Hayek, about how like even societies that have a tradition of freedom and a tradition of liberalism can, in the good way, obviously, can change fundamentally over time through the implementation of bureaucracies and policies. And then they'll just completely get disconnected from their heritage, and they won't recognize force as force, and they can then elect themselves into like a dictatorship. Like I call it getting cliffed out. I used to guide in the Rockies, and sometimes people, so for people who don't know, sometimes you're climbing and you get into a spot and you got yourself there, but you cannot get out of that spot. You're cliffed out, and someone has to come and get you out. So just because you might use some means to get into a thing that was, democratic or whatever consensus, you can vote yourself into a dictatorship. So I guess my point is, like, I agree with you that there are people who recognize it as force, and there are people who, so at the very beginning, you talked about the racial disparities and stuff with how vax passports are systemic racism. So to that, people recognizing things for what they are, I think that part of that is they have to have some type of unfiltered access to truth, whether with their own eyes or through the means of getting information. And we know that most of the media and social media is just garbage. So they have to see it. So even just think about like how all the defund the police stuff. I mean, Heather McDonald wrote about the Ferguson effect, years ago, and how these policies are destroying the inner city communities, but that hasn't stopped people from continuing to pass these policies and defund the police and all this other stuff, even though it is having it is a systemic racism thing. It's having an overt negative impact on the inner city with these things, but the information doesn't get out there. Even when CNN runs a thing about how crime is going up, like we have no idea what's going on. It must be, AOC, they must need that bread, also
it's summer.
Giant JVC. Yeah, it's summer. They also need a giant JVC TV or something. And so like, I guess my point is that one, people have to recognize force as force, otherwise they're going to go along with it. Two, even those pivots, they seem to have consequences, right? Like, so San Francisco, vaccine passports, New York City, doing the stuff with like teachers have to do all this stuff. And I think that they add in the asterisks of, or get tested, be subject to testing every week. And that's what France did a long time ago. And then Macron just passed a thing. It's like, we're not going to pay for testing anymore. So you're just going to have to get vaccinated or lose your job. That's going to be the next iteration of that.
Of course.
So my point is that I think there are a lot of people who will recognize that as force, but then they're going to leave those places you talked about, like, flee or something like that. And then there's like those strongholds, I call it like the metropolitan hive mind. And it kind of operates like the Shimmer from the Annihilation book, where it's like this place you go into it and reality is completely distorted. And not everyone in there realizes it's completely distorted, because they're in the Shimmer and they all operate like a hive mind. I think people are going to be leaving those places, but it's just going to further hermetically seal off those giant strongholds from any input. Like the mental exercise I do is like, okay, let's draw a Venn diagram of the places where CRT is unopposed in schools, where drag queen story hour is still advocated, where there's going to be all the bathroom sharing of whatever, in the schools, where there's going to be 6-year-olds wearing masks in schools and vaccine mandates and passports and stuff. Like, that's a circle. That Venn diagram is a circle. And the problem is that those are the places that wield the most institutional power, especially on a governmental level. Like, it's like basically this last election came down to what, 4 cities, basically 4 cities. And so like, I agree with you that people are going to say no, but I think a lot of that no is just going to manifest in, I'm leaving. I mean, I was at the store, so I'm here in Bozeman. I was at the store last night and I asked this girl, I'm like, hey, how come you guys only have beer and wine? How come there's no liquor? Is that like a Montana thing? And she said, I don't know. I just moved here from California. I said, whoa, what brought you to Montana? She said, it's not California. And so I think people are, it's like, I bet you there's 1,000 stories like that here. And so I guess my point is that yes, there are people that are leaving. Yes, there are people that are waking up and saying no, but there are enough people who don't recognize force as force, who are willfully ignorant. I call them this freaking NPR. People listen to NPR on the way to work every morning or while they're getting ready, and, think that the New Yorker, these are the same people who say, yeah, CNN has really become politicized. I'm glad the New York Times is still unbiased, like those kinds of people. There's so many of them that they kind of enable this and create that false sense of consensus and kind of help prop it up. And I'm just not sure that even the reality of the way like that you mentioned in the beginning, it's going to be like shown like how morally bankrupt this is. Like, I'm not sure that we're going to have enough people in the places that matter that they're going to be able to oppose it, because they're just going to leave. I mean, I know there's a gal in my locals community. They're moving from California to Montana. There's a buddy of mine who works at a hospital in San Francisco. He's like, we're getting out of here. I'm not going to do this thing. I know people who are just leaving those areas, but that doesn't reform those areas. And it helps actually further like intensify and concentrate the power that they wield, at least in the short term. So does that make sense? I feel like the information is one of the big problems there.
Is in the short term. And there's room for some acceleration. Like, everybody's like, oh, Cuomo's stepping down and they're just going to replace him with somebody worse.
Totally.
And I tweeted, I'm excited for the acceleration in New York City. Like, there is actually a cost. If all the sane people and all the effective people are actually leaving an area, it doesn't feel like there's a cost, but there is a cost. That area will start to degrade. This is what happened to Detroit in the 1960s when they decided to pull the same kind of crap. And they had all the riots, the race riots, et cetera, and they burned out parts of Detroit. And now I'm not going to hold, Detroit's not really a healthy place still. I'm not saying that San Francisco is going to end up good out of this, or that New York City doesn't have a 30-year trajectory to fixing itself. But the problems start to multiply very quickly when that's the more good people who leave, the more sane people who leave, the more effective people who go somewhere else. Maybe they bring those problems with them. They vote stupidly when they get wherever they go. But the place that they're leaving becomes measurably worse. And eventually, I hate to dip into it because this is like the, what do they call it? A critical moment in that's what Henry Giroux calls it. Or this is kind of like Marx's awakening to consciousness. Eventually, like, Lenin saying accelerate the contradictions, there's a little bit there, because it's like, yeah, okay, let them become the victim of their own failure, which is a different thing than what Lenin was doing. Lenin was making people the victim of his failure. This is let them become the victim of their own failure and let people start to wake up. And you say, you don't know if enough people will wake up soon enough. And I agree. That's the big question. But then when I say that these things are red pill hurricanes, that's what I'm talking about. So I had this same conversation with people, not the one we're having now, but the one I'm about to describe, with 3 different people wholly independently. And I know they're wholly independent because it wasn't like, oh, I was at a conference and I just talked to 3 people. No, these were like in an airport, on an airplane, and somewhere else. Just totally independent conversations. And the people said the exact same thing. These are all, I'm assuming, I don't know for sure. I know some of them, but I don't know all of them. Left-leaning people. And I've seen this conversation on social media many times as well, from people who declare that they are lifelong Democratic voters, et cetera. And what they're saying is, and this is almost an exact quote from one of them, I got the vaccine because I believed if that's the one thing that I have to do to get society back on track, to get everything back to normal, I'm willing to take that one step. And then looking back now, I realize that that was a form of coercion. We shouldn't have had to do this, especially since it doesn't work the way that it seems like we were promised. We shouldn't have had to do this in the first place to get our society back. The realization that society being closed was a political decision, not a genuine public health decision, is something that a lot of people who have voluntarily taken the vaccine, which is a level of obvious commitment to this cause, for the purpose, self-admitted, for the purpose of that's what we have to do to open society again. And now they're saying, I don't know if that was a legitimate reason to get it. The one person I talked to said, I'm still glad I got it. I still hope it offers me some measure of protection. I would get it again, but I wouldn't get it for the reason that this is how we open society. It just becomes a personal decision about my health and weighing out the good versus the bad. I also had a number of conversations with people who are now saying, I was sick for 8 days after I got the second dose of the vaccine, or 4 days or 3 days, or I had this reaction or that reaction. And now I don't know if it was worth it. And so the number of people that are red pilling, in a sense, if we use that metaphor, to this is shocking right now. And the question, you are correct. The open question, the question that matters is, will it be enough people? And will those people be located in places where they can make that kind of a difference? That's an open question that I don't know the answer to. I just know that I'm hopeful, given how quickly I'm hearing people say this. I'm hearing, scuttlebutt, as the word goes, from all different corners of our society, where our organization or institution, some of which are gigantic ones affiliated with the federal government, for example, was going all in on this. And now there's a massive boomerang effect on all of it. It went to where, it was, clear majority opinion. Yeah, we have to take these steps, whether it was the vaccine, whether it's the racial stuff, the equity, whatever. And now it's a clear majority are like, wait a minute, something's wrong with this. This isn't working. And it's not like, oh, necessarily these people are reading people like myself or Chris Rufo or the people criticizing it. Some of them might be, but they're noticing with their own eyes. Like the equity programs, the diversity training is creating division, not harmony. It's sold as it's going to create better harmony, and it's creating division. The vaccines are, I think that this Delta, whatever vaccine resistant, it's dropping. People are like, wait a minute. Just the fact of, you said if we got vaccinated, we don't have to wear masks and be locked down again. And here you are masking and locking us down again. The scapegoating of the unvaccinated is very effective, just like the scapegoating of whiteness has been very effective. But the effectiveness seems to, the people, I think, have hit a fatigue. And I don't mean all of them, your NPR bots or whatever, I get it. But
sorry,
sorry, half of my family too.
Yes.
There's a fatigue I'm seeing with average, everyday, normal Americans. I'm thinking of friends that I have here and there around the country. I'm thinking of other members of my family. And the only good word I can think of for it is fatigue, if not the beginnings of disgust. For stop scapegoating people over stuff, whether it's their skin color, whether it's their vaccination status. The scapegoating itself is turning people off. And I don't know what proportions. I don't have poll data on this, but I'm hearing it enough to where it's like most of what I don't know what my prediction accuracy has been. I'm guessing it's north of 85%, south of 95%. So somewhere in that, A minus B plus range in my prediction accuracy. And this is going back into like 2017 when we were doing the grievance studies affair. We knew we were going to get destroyed, right? And then all of a sudden, right before it started to come out, that summer before it came out in 2018, I was like, the wind shifted. So I'm always like licking my finger and sticking it in the air, and the wind is shifting. Right now, the number of people, everyday people that I'm hearing from and talking to, number of people admitting that they're lifelong Democrat voters, always been on the left, and saying qualitatively different things, is giving me a measure of hope. Now, the question is, will these things happen in the right places? Mama Bear showing up to school boards is already happening in the right places. So that's a huge one that's happening in the right place. I just tweeted today that if shareholders will start showing up at their shareholder meetings for their companies, exactly like the Mama Bears are showing up to defend their schools, these shareholders have been defrauded. They have a shareholder agreement. The companies that they are shareholders in have a fiduciary responsibility to them. They've known they were going to shift away from a shareholder model to a stakeholder model for some amount of time. And that maybe wasn't properly disclosed, or was disclosed in like coded language or whatever, and was never properly communicated what that means for those shareholders. If those shareholders become just as angry and start showing up in the same kind of numbers with the same kind of organization, like, what are you doing? What do you know, and when did you know it? And why did you lead us down this path, or whatever? You could look at it, for example, like, let's imagine that one of the things that the government is attempting to do long term is to phase out all gasoline automobiles. Okay, we're going to go to totally electric vehicles, all self-driving, all manually driven vehicles, any of these things. At some point, people in charge have known this, and yet you have the company still A, selling these vehicles to people, and B, telling their shareholders that we have this vision, blah blah blah, we're going to do this, that, and the other thing. And it's like, at some point there was lying involved. If you look at this thing that's going on with like BlackRock buying everything up, at some point, those big investment bankers knew the things that they were talking about didn't represent what they were really going to do. And the shareholders should be showing up and yelling. So that's an avenue where somebody should be showing up and yelling. And I don't think that matters where you live. As far as municipalities go, I think we're going to see, because of the scale of what's been allowed to occur in our major cities, or especially our bluest major cities, we can name Portland and Seattle, San Francisco, probably Sacramento, staying on the West Coast, but then we get to Minneapolis, Chicago, New York, maybe Boston to a degree. We can start to name these cities. Atlanta's a little bit on the edge. I wouldn't say it's that bad, but you start looking at these like major cities, maybe Austin's on the edge. You start looking at these things. We're probably going to lose a lot of them, like we lost Detroit. And I don't know that it's like, I don't have a moral judgment about it. I'm sad, it's tragic, but on the other hand, I don't know that it can be stopped. We allowed the cancer to eat too deeply into these things. That's what happened in Detroit in 1967, 8, and 9, and 50 years later, Detroit is still struggling. It doesn't magically come back. Now, you could also point out that Detroit has largely been under corrupt and awful management for most of those 50 years, if not all of those 50 years, and maybe it would have had a better recovery and comeback had that not been the case. But there, lots of things can be involved. So I don't know. I think we're going to lose the power of a lot of our major cities, but we're going to see other cities like Miami become much stronger. We're going to see cities like Nashville become much stronger. We're going to see cities like Dallas become probably stronger. These places that people are flooding to out of those other cities that are welcoming the cities in Florida, I think in particular, are going to become very powerful. And so maybe the powerhouse that is California becomes relocated into Florida. And I don't know that that's necessarily this terrible thing in California. I mean, I would rather not. California is beautiful. I don't wish any ill on the citizens of California, of course, et cetera. But
except Nancy Pelosi.
Sure. Yeah. Ugly communists accepted. But the truth is, with these cities, I don't think it necessarily has to be bad. Also, somebody asked me the other night when I was in Wisconsin, if I thought all was lost or whatever. And I was like, no, I don't, because I actually am seeing, like in the state of Florida with Ron DeSantis's leadership, you get the right. It was like, do you think the institutions are just completely like nobody will trust them and they're gone completely? We've lost them. And I'm like, no, I actually think most of them are recoverable. Not some will fall, but most of them are recoverable. And the example I gave is DeSantis. DeSantis won by a handful of votes over some guy who would have been a total lunatic. It would have been as bad as Whitmer or worse, as bad as Cuomo or worse in Florida. And Florida would be it'd be a plus meth and prostitutes or whatever that story was. Yep. And Gillum, it would have been a disaster. Yeah. Gillum, that's right. It would have been a complete disaster. And then DeSantis, so you have a state that's on the verge of total corruption. You have the right guy for whatever set of reasons, get into the job at the right time, take responsibility, take leadership. And within a very short period of time, faith in the institution of Florida, if you think of it as an institutional object, has skyrocketed. People call it the freest place on earth. People are looking to DeSantis to save the world. They're asking him to be governor of like every state, basically. Other governors are having to kind of like look at this, especially the red governors, and figure out what do they do. All the blue governors are trying to blame DeSantis for everything that possibly could be blamed on him, the White House as well. And so it's like, but people believe in Florida. So we were, a knife's edge away from Florida being one of the disaster states. And now people believe in Florida. Why? Because the right guy got in the job and did the right thing. So maybe in the next iteration, maybe, I don't know if it's Larry Elder, I don't know who it is, but maybe we succeed in pulling Newsom out of California, put somebody in who's competent and who's not as corrupt and who starts to make the right kind of decisions, who takes the right kind of leadership. Faith in California can start coming back. And I think that's true in whether it's California as a whole. I think it could be true in, we get Beetlejuice out of Chicago and put in somebody, I think something could actually, people want to have faith in their cities. They want to have faith in their counties. They want to have faith in their states. They want to have faith in the country. You start getting the people into these institutional positions, and I think that they can be recovered. The scary ones for me are the ones where I see it at the level of possibility in many states, not necessarily all of them. I think Washington, for example, and Oregon are going to be dodgy for a hot minute. And
Somalia, man. Mogadishu.
Yeah, I know. Most of Oregon, like, can we become Idaho now? And Idaho's like, yeah, So I don't know.